Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. So this week we are talking about chapter 4, and I'm pulling my notes up, so excuse me. All right, so we're talking about chapter 4, and the setting is, of course, North America, not yet the United States, and the time frame is between the late 1600s and 1760, somewhere in there, 1770. And so a couple of things to make note of in the reading. I thought the reading was really interesting because it talked about Dr. Alexander Hamilton traveling the country and looking at all the diversity and talking about his experiences. And I think that's important to remember that the country started as a very diverse place. So that's something you'll read about as you go through. And the other thing that's important is that you probably know that the next chapter is going to be about the American Revolution, or you should know, or maybe you shouldn't know, but that's what's going to happen. I mean, the English colonies become more and more independent, and the dislike for the British Parliament grows after several events that we haven't read about yet. But the idea is that this chapter is before that. So as you read through the chapter, think about this idea of the colonist and independence, and ideas about liberty and what their motivations are and what some hints or indications are that that's going to happen. And so that leads us into what's happening this week, which is you have an essay, and there's two questions on the essay, and they have very specific instructions that I will talk to you about. But one of the questions asks you to provide two examples of hints or events or ideas or thoughts that provide examples for a growing tide of independence or liberty that give us hints or clues. So you're going to pick these out. You're going to read and say, the colonists were reading about the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment questioned the authority of kings. Boy, that's a good example of a motivation or a thought that leads to the colonists growing independent or thinking about splitting up from England. So think about that as you go through the reading, and I'll get into a few specifics. And then the other thing is we talked about Alexander Hamilton and the writings that you will read about in the text and the diversity. But the flip side of that diversity is the discrimination and sort of this. Well, there's no sort of about it. This Anglo-English colonist white rich guy culture where everyone is discriminated against, if you're a person of color for sure, or if you're a woman for sure, or if you're poor for sure, or you're destitute for sure. So there's a lot of bias there. And so I think personally that the bias we see then relates to today's social problems. So I call the bias social problems back then. So if you read about a social problem in the text, or read about an instance or an example of racism, or an example of gender bias, or an example of a wealth gap, then that's going to be the other essay question. And I'll give you more example, or I'll give you more clues as we go through. So speaking of the essay, as you read through my bullet points in my reading notes, I have bolded things, and I have said, hey, here's sure a good section to use for this essay example. So, I mean, I'm giving you the answers right here. But really the biggies this week, as far as the content goes, what I want us to take away from it is that it's a real diverse place in North America in the 1700s, and there's already indications that North America is just going to be such an economic powerhouse that England's going to lose control. So that's the fascinating part of the chapter. Some of the minutia or the fine points that we probably should know about is that the Spanish and the French have a large presence in North America at this time. The English colonists, the original colonies, only have a little bit of land between the Atlantic and almost to the Appalachians, but not quite. One of the things you read about is the Ohio country in this chapter, and it's really talking about if you're in Ohio, as I am right now, of course this area, but also south of here, and it talks about how far west Pittsburgh was, that when the English got to Pittsburgh, they were running into the French because the French had control of the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. So there's a lot of stuff going on in this chapter, and I think the presence of those other empires, Spain and France, in North America at that time is really important because there's going to be some wars. Okay, I mean, empires always fight, so you're going to see, Queen Anne's War and some of these other wars. And it's not important to me that you know about the wars or what they were about. I mean, they're fascinating, but I don't really care about that stuff. But what's important is that these wars ending up costing people money, and England goes into a lot of debt. And when governments need money, where do they go? They go to the citizens and they tax us. So these wars, someone has to pay for, and that's going to be an important part of independence movement by the colonists as we get into the next chapter. So kind of pay attention to that. What else? Know what Enlightenment thought is, and again, it's not an event like, hey, tomorrow is Enlightenment Thought Day. It's a broad historical framework for a type of thinking and a change in thinking that occurred in the 1700s that it really revolves around logic and science and a whole bunch of cool stuff. So know what Enlightenment thought is. Know what impact Enlightenment thought could have on this growing tide of independence. That's something you could write about. Know what the Great Awakening was, and the First Great Awakening, this sort of religious revivalism in the country, and that's another indicator in some ways of independence, because the colonists at this point are breaking away from the Church of England. They're breaking away from the dogma of the Catholic Church. They're breaking away from the strictness of the Puritans. And so there are all of these new Christian denominations being formed, Baptist and Methodist, and all of this stuff going on, which sort of represents a liberty or freedom or reforming of religious ideas, breaking away from the old into the new. So again, it sort of ties in with this theme of growing tide of independence. So I hope I didn't repeat myself there. Anyway, so yeah, the Great Awakening is fascinating. Reading about churches is fascinating. Make sure you know who Onesimus is. He is the slave in Boston who a guy named Cotton Mather owned, who really invented a smallpox inoculation and saved literally thousands of lives. And again, make note of that, because that idea of inoculations for smallpox came from Africa. This slave knew about it, and it's a really great story. So they talk about it in the book. So make sure you read about it because it's cool. And let's see, make sure you know what the Stono Rebellion is. Really important to know about these slave uprisings. On the one hand, you can't blame people that are captured for trying to escape. On the other hand, anytime there's an act of violence, all this fear it comes about, like the war on crime right now in politics. So it's the same with the Stoner Rebellion. It was a great attempt at independence by some slaves, but at the same time it set the cause back so far because it gave the plantation owners ammunition to say, hey, these people are killers. And so it really reinforces this whole idea of discrimination and socially constructed racial issues. So I think that's it. Let me talk about the essay a little more. So I told you there were two questions. One of them has you provide 3 examples of social problems back then, which is like a social problem is like an example of racism or an example of discrimination. So you need to provide 3 examples from the reading of some sort of social problems that you read about, and you need to relate them back to today. So, and it's not a big analysis, and I provide an example in the directions, and it'll end up being 4 to 5 sentences long. Okay, so it's really easy. Just make sure you follow the directions to the number. Proper grammar and the citations. My citation style is unorthodox and super easy, but I want to know where you found stuff in the book. Follow the example that I give you exactly. Okay, do not deviate. And so there's that. So that first question is about these social issues, identifying 3 examples. And the second question is identifying 2 examples, identifying and discussing 2 examples of a rising tide of independence or liberty amongst the colonists. So you could say, well, from the reading, the Enlightenment is indicative of a motivation for the colonists to gain independence because a core component of the Enlightenment is questioning the authority of kings or something like that. So two, 3 sentences. So your whole essay assignment is going to be like 2 paragraphs. Don't write 2 or 3 pages. If I ask for 3 examples, use 3. Do not use 2 or do not use 4. Okay. Don't make it an epic. Just make it plain and make sure you follow the directions. The other thing is you have to do this in Microsoft Word. So type it out in a Word document and then you're going to submit it online through the module and you're going to upload it into Blackboard. That's the way it has to be done. If you do it any other way, it won't count. Okay, so make sure you do it that way because I'd hate to see you go to all this work and your work not count because you didn't do it in Word or you didn't cite it or you didn't do something like that. I go way overboard. I provide over a page of instructions for a 2 paragraph essay. So I tell you exactly what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And if I didn't address it, just use your best judgment. Okay, but I mean, no weird fonts, do it in Word. No live links, of course. I give you examples. Don't copy my example. Use your citations and make sure your grammar is correct. If you don't capitalize someone's name, or I have students that are like, oh, they're talking about George Washington, and they'll say, well, George said this. If you do that, you'll fail. This is college level writing, so try your best to get it right. This is an early assignment, so I won't be as strict. But again, look at the instructions and look at the rubric, do exactly what they say, and you're going to be good to go because it's worth a couple of 100 points, so you want to do the best you can on it. So that's it for this week. If you have any questions, let me know, and I hope you stay safe and stay in touch. Bye-bye.